I'd like to acknowledge where tonight's event is taking place, the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work in their community. So as you probably know, this is part of a larger David Lynch retrospective. It's going on through the summer. And just a reminder, we have a lot more screenings left, but just a reminder, on August 18th, we're going to be showing 3 episodes from Twin Peaks: The Return. So it's a really great chance to see those on the big screen.
So we're actually going to start with a video by the video essayist Kevin Lee. When my book came out a few years ago, Kevin offered to make a video essay that was excerpted from the opening chapter of my book. And I think it gives you a sense of my approach, my interest in Lynch, which is, the book is maybe less a biography of a person than an anatomy of a sensibility. In some ways, my starting point was not Lynch per se, but the idea of the Lynchian. And this video that Kevin made is called "What is Lynchian?" I'm going to play that now. So the film that you're about to see was, until recently, considered one of Lynch's biggest failures, and certainly one of his most perverse projects. But I want to say a bit about how Fire Walk With Me fits into the Twin Peaks universe and how central that universe is to Lynch's body of work. Twin Peaks is now a narrative enterprise that spans 3 seasons of television, 48 episodes in total, and 1 feature film over a 25-year period. Some 44 hours in all, which is more than double the running time of Lynch's 9 other features put together. The size of this canvas is significant because I think it tells us a lot about how Lynch thinks about narrative. The reason Lynch turned to television in the first place, and the reason he has kept returning to it despite some rather unhappy outcomes in terms of clashes with network executives, is because it's a form that allows him to experiment with immersive storytelling. In his almost childlike terms, to live in a story and to keep it alive as long as possible. Lynch often talks about filmmaking as world building and about wanting to inhabit and linger in the worlds that he creates. Umberto Eco described cult texts as works that invite fans into, quote, a completely furnished world. The original Twin Peaks seasons, which ran from 1990 to 1991, certainly fulfill this criterion. Twin Peaks was a mass culture text that called for communal decoding. It took event television to new heights, inspiring coffee and cherry pie viewing parties and fostering a community of avid interpreters, from doctoral students dissecting the semiotics of Cobbler, as Premiere Magazine snidely put it, to a zine called Wrapped in Plastic that ran a full 75 issues until 2005. Lynch has also said that endings are, quote, terrible things. Here, perhaps unwittingly, he invokes Scheherazade, the mythic queen of 1001 Nights, who perfected the art of the cliffhanger as a hedge against death. For Lynch, narrative closure is a form of death, which explains why he was reluctant to solve the murder mystery at the heart of Twin Peaks, a show that began by asking who killed Laura Palmer. When he was pressed by journalists during the first season about being able to deliver a conventional resolution or satisfying answer, Lynch lost his patience. He said, "Closure, I keep hearing that word. As soon as a show has a sense of closure, it gives you an excuse to forget you've seen the damn thing." Here we might think as well of Borges, who said that, quote, the solution of a mystery is always less impressive than the mystery itself. For Lynch, the attraction of the serial form was precisely the freedom that it offered, even if momentary, from obligations like closure. But for the network, ABC, and a sizable portion of the television audience, the idea that the creators of Twin Peaks might be making it up as they went along was cause for alarm. The executives strong-armed from Lynch and his co-creator Mark Frost an assurance that the murder would be solved sooner rather than later. But the episodes that followed the revelation, with Frost and Lynch attending to other projects, were dominated by haphazard plots, and with ratings on the decline, Lynch returned to direct the season finale. This would be the final episode of season 2, knowing that it would likely be the last episode. The prospect of finality did not compel Lynch to wrap things up, but to leave them even more open. This is perhaps the most disturbing hour of television of all time, at least until we get to season 3, and it introduces what would become a signature move for Lynch. You could say that most of his films from that point on do not end so much as open up onto the abyss. Which brings us to this feature from 1992, a Twin Peaks spin-off film that many detractors wrote off sight unseen as an unseemly cash-in, an attempt to milk the phenomenon for one last drop of profit. Not that anything about this endeavor seems particularly business-minded. The last episode of Twin Peaks had drawn a mere 6 million viewers, less than a fifth of its initial audience. And one would think that a more commercial Twin Peaks film would have teased out a few of its unsolved mysteries or picked up from the show's cliffhanger ending. But instead, Fire Walk with Me is a prequel, a plunge into the show's dark heart and defining trauma, chronicling the final week in the brief life of Laura Palmer. This is, in other words, a film that is predestined to end with the brutal murder of its protagonist. At the press conference in Cannes, where the film was booed, Lynch said, "I happen to be in love with the world of Twin Peaks and the characters that exist there. I wanted to go back into the world before it started on the series and to see what was there, to actually see things that we had heard about." He later described the film as a reanimation project. "I was in love with the character of Laura Palmer and her contradictions, radiant on the surface, dying inside. I wanted to see her live, move, and talk." The movie grants Laura, who's the absent center of Twin Peaks, the show, the opportunity to inhabit a void, and the actress Cheryl Lee seizes the challenge with a startling ferocity in what the critic Grail Marcus has called as heedless a performance as any in the history of film. Just as Lynch's films can be seen as charged environments that allow parallel planes, multiple selves, and wildly conflicting moods and emotions to coexist, Lee fashions a coherent person out of a fantasy figure who had been all things to all people, vacillating between victim and heroine, heartless vamp, and little girl lost. Has everybody here seen the television series? Has anybody not seen the television series? Okay, I'm just trying to figure out if I should say something. I think it's okay. I mean, I don't know. It's a 25-year-old film, I think. Fire Walk with Me turns on Laura's discovery that Bob, her spectral tormentor and abuser who eventually kills her, is none other than her father. This is something we, the audience, already know since it was revealed in the television series. But the film suggests that for Laura, this is a cyclical, recurring trauma, something she learns and wills herself to forget again and again. Revolving around one of the most famous dead girls in recent popular culture, Twin Peaks is a key exhibit in debates about Lynch's portrayal of women. After the first season, Ms. Magazine published an essay titled "Lynching Women" by a critic, Diana Hume-George, who called herself a fan of the show, but objected nonetheless to its reptilian sexual politics. Audience and creators alike, she argued, got off on the sexually tortured, brutally murdered, mutilated body of an adolescent girl. Edgar Allan Poe believed that, quote, "the death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world." Twin Peaks, the series, might have gone along with that notion, but Fire Walk with Me rejects it. As Lee plays Laura, she is desperately alive. Some faulted the film as a cruel exhumation, resurrecting Laura only to kill her again. But Lynch's point is to show us how she lived and what she experienced. Her transformation from object to subject was, for David Foster Wallace, the most morally ambitious thing a Lynch movie has ever tried to do. Fire Walk with Me left audiences at the Cannes premiere, as one American critic put it, drained and confused. When the film opened 3 months later, the viciousness of the reviews surpassed those of his earlier flop, Dune. "It's not the worst movie ever made, it just seems to be," Vincent Canby wrote in the New York Times. Its 134 minutes induce a state of simulated brain death. Quentin Tarantino, never one to keep an opinion to himself, told an interviewer, David Lynch has disappeared so far up his own ass that I have no desire to see another Lynch film until I hear something different. The film was a flop, grossing less than half of its budget at the US box office. I want to say a bit about how I think Lynch's work reflect their times, and how you can see this in the various iterations of Twin Peaks, since they do span a quarter century. Lynch is not what you would call a social realist, but I would argue that in both obvious and subtle ways, many of his films have their antennas up for the larger forces underlying their particular eras. Blue Velvet is regularly called a defining film of the 1980s, keyed into postmodern anxiety and the brittle optimism of the Reagan years. Lynch's 90s work, Twin Peaks The Show, Fire Walk with Me, and Lost Highway, I think are exemplary artifacts of pre-millennial America. This was the decade of Timothy McVeigh and the Unabomber, the Branch Davidian and Heaven's Gate cults, the televised trials of the Menendez brothers and O.J. Simpson, whose case Lynch has acknowledged was an influence on Lost Highway. The culture of confession and the accelerating information age created a potent incubator for apocalyptic thoughts. With the end of the century panic came a surge in new paradigms of trauma and memory, new ways of understanding our fracturing realities and divided selves. The historian Elaine Showalter coined the term histories, H-Y-S, T-O-R-I-E-S, to describe the narratives that underpin the, quote, hysterical epidemics of the late 20th century, which in her account range from chronic fatigue syndrome to alien abduction. And if these hysterical outbreaks were a contagion of sorts, the prime mediums of transmission included the daytime talk show circuit and the pop culture imagination. Most of Lynch's late films can be read as post-traumatic narratives. In Fire Walk with Me, Laura's discovery that her father is her abuser surfaces as a recovered memory, a popular diagnosis in the 1980s and 90s, often involving childhood abuse. It would soon become a controversial one as counter charges of false and implanted memory surfaced. I want to say a bit about The Return, which I was glad to hear Brad say is actually showing here on the big screen. Definitely not an opportunity to be missed. Fire Walk with Me, among other things, also lays the groundwork for The Return, which I am increasingly convinced is Lynch's great masterpiece, a culmination and summation that encompasses all of his themes, modes, and obsessions. Absorbing a 25-year gap into its narrative, The Return not only rejects nostalgia, it is a revival that acknowledges the impossibility of returning to the Twin Peaks that we knew. Indeed, that ends by obliterating it once and for all. It is the one work of narrative art that, for me, most matches the experiences of living in Trump's America. Here again is, I think, a key to how Lynch is, despite appearances, somebody whose work has a deep subliminal cultural and political relevance. Those of us who watched The Return over the summer of 2017, I'm sure remember the experience vividly. It played out as this months-long fever dream of dread and dissociation that was seemingly tailor-made for our real-life waking nightmare of crisis and collapse. So I will conclude by just, enumerating a few ways in which I think this is a pivotal film, really trying to make a case for this extremely underappreciated film in the Lynch corpus. For Lynch, I think the entire Twin Peaks project has been a laboratory of sorts, where he has worked out ideas that are central to his work, including the uses of duration, the principles of doubling, and the cosmic laws of his narrative universe. Fire Walk with Me, in particular, finds him moving toward more direct expressions of emotion and emotional terror, perhaps his ultimate subject. And while Lynch has always been obsessed with dualities, Fire Walk with Me was his first bifurcated film. He would use this two-part structure again in Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive. This is also a film that foregrounds the particular strain of ambiguity that would become central to his later puzzle films, which all hinge on alter ego confusion, this question of where one character ends and another begins. And lastly, I think it is a film that introduces this question of revisiting the past that is so important to the second half of Lynch's career. Specifically, this desire to go back to relive, or to witness, to relive, or maybe even to rewrite the past. This is the impulse behind Lost Highway, behind Mulholland Drive, certainly behind Twin Peaks: The Return. And it's one that runs through a lot of cinema, including Vertigo, a film that is clearly very important to Lynch. But those films were all tragedies of failed reenactment. And I think why The Return seems like such a culmination for Lynch, and why it has, I think, the most chilling ending in all of Lynch, is that it dares to imagine a successful and not a failed reenactment. And I think this is the film that sort of lays the groundwork for all these questions that Lynch would explore for the next 25 years of his career. I think I'll leave you with that. And it's a pretty harrowing film, if you haven't seen it before. But I also think it's one that will stay with you. So thank you all for being here, and thanks to Brad for the invitation.